So, Mr. Birling describes himself as a hard-headed, practical man of business. Okay, and when we think about that idea of being hard-headed, we think of this image. I want you to notice the arrows kind of bouncing off the head and the top of Mr. Birling. And it's this idea that Mr. Birling sees himself as a proudly powerful individual. Now, I want you to think like Mr. Birling is a man of the bourgeoisie in the golden era of capitalism, embodied and empowered by patriarchy. He is a powerful man. He has a lot of societal power to further that security and stability that he has, which is probably why he is hard-headed, because he has not really had to face any change in his life. He's not really been a victim or a person that has had to suffer from difference or injustice in his life, because he is a powerful, wealthy man in an era of capitalism. And Mr. Birling is hard-headed. That means he's proudly powerful, but also like stubborn. Someone who stubbornly refuses any other ideas. He stubbornly refuses to change, because when a new idea comes in, it just bounces off Mr. Birling because he's hard-headed. So he stubbornly refuses to listen. And we know that he stubbornly refuses to listen because he has the most dialogue at the beginning of the play, and quite often when his other guest or his family start to speak. So for example, Eric tries to speak, he immediately interrupts and continues his big long monologues. So this word hard for Mr. Birling, if something is hard, it's tough to penetrate, tough to get into. And I want you to kind of see it like the oyster around, that oyster shell around Scrooge, that metaphorical barrier. That's the same with Mr. Birling. He is dogmatic in his views. Stubborn and dogmatic, he refuses to change. And by refusing to listen to others, we see this person as a person who will keep things very traditional, very much the same as they've always been. His values create regression. He is not going to be a progressive character. Okay? And his dogmatic stubbornness shows his dogmatic dedication to capitalism. Yeah? He's hard-headed in his views. He is supportive constantly of capitalism. So he is dogmatically dedicated to capitalism. And he's hard-headed and proud of these stubborn and dogmatic views. It is almost like he has pride in the stability of his views. I'm going to refer to his views as dogmas. A dogma is just a viewpoint that you have that stays the same. It does not change. And he always thinks that way. So he has this proudness, this pride in his dogmas to always stay the same, to the point where he rejects any other ideas. And Priestley's done this really to exaggerate the determination of the bourgeoisie to maintain that status quo. So we always think of the bourgeoisie of this ladder and this needing to maintain their status quo at the top. If we think about this in terms of the Edwardian social hierarchy, Mr. Birling's dogmas, they maintain that belief that some of us are born at the top and some of us are born at the bottom, and where you're born is where you stay. And unethical and unjust money practices are just part of society, and if someone struggles because of that, that is just the way it is. And Mr. Birling's hard-headedness creates and maintains this status quo. So what Priestley is trying to say about Mr. Birling, and by proxy the bourgeoisie, is that stubborn, dogmatic and hubristic beliefs maintain the Edwardian social hierarchy. They maintain the status quo. And we see that when he rejects any form of collectivism. So we know that collectivism is what's best for the many. Yeah? Collectivism is the idea of community and coming together. And we see this through Mr. Birling when he says, community and all that nonsense. He says that there would be like bees in a hive all mixed up together. And this image of bees in a hive is really interesting because bees are bugs that are collective. Yeah, they work together. And they work together to produce honey. So their labour creates something, it creates honey. And the produce that the bees make is used to nourish the hive. So by making honey, they create this kind of nourishing hive, don't they? So they produce honey that nourishes the hive. So the produce of bees helps the community. So that is a symbol of collectivism. What each body creates helps the whole community. It helps the whole hive. Bees in a hive, in other words, bees are workers and a hive is a community. So that really symbolically is representing workers in a community. The bees are the workers, they're essentially the proletariat. And to Mr. Birling, collectivism and community is a threat to the status quo. It's a threat to that stability because collectivism doesn't help just one. It is not individualism. Collectivism helps the many. And it doesn't maintain a ladder, it creates an equal playing field. And because it is a threat to the stability of his dogmas, he sees it as silly, as nonsense. So it's all silly nonsense to him because it just bounces off his head. And because it's a threat to the social hierarchy, he rejects it and doesn't allow it and doesn't consider it at all. And it's interesting, really, because the 1945 audience would know that collective ideals are more common. People had to collectively come together during the war, and the Labour Party had just come into power in 1945, so the United Kingdom had voted for a collective socialist party. So clearly the 1945 audience would understand that this belief system is very selfish and it's very hubristic. And it's for the one, not for the many. It's for people like Mr. Birling only. It is not for all of the workers. And we see how the 1945 audience would view Mr. Birling, especially through when he says the Titanic would be unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. So first thing I want you to think about with this idea is the Titanic itself, okay? So the Titanic sunk in 1912. It was a ship, and it sunk in the April of 1912. Yeah. And think of the Titanic itself. The Titanic is a ship, and a ship has to be built. So it is built by the working class. It is built by workers, by labourers who have the skills to build something like that. But it is used by the bourgeoisie. Because it is only the rich that could afford the tickets to go on to the Titanic. So although it was built by the workers, it was used by the bourgeoisie. So the Titanic itself is a perfect symbol of the class system, of the Edwardian social hierarchy. It is a symbol of this social hierarchy that is really unfair because by using the labour of the workers, the bourgeoisie benefit, but the workers do not benefit. They're underpaid, overworked, they're not unionised yet, etc. And he describes it as unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. But this symbol of the social hierarchy, this symbol of capitalism itself, did sink. The 1945 audience knows that it sunk. So really, we see here some foolish ignorance. He's ignorant, isn't he, by calling this absolutely unsinkable, because it's a ship at the end of the day, all ships can sink. And this foolish ignorance represents his confidence in the stability of it. He had this confidence that this ship itself would be entirely stable, which could represent his confidence in the stability of the status quo. He believed it was entirely stable. He believed in the stability of the ship, and by proxy, the stability of the Edwardian social hierarchy, the Edwardian status quo. But actually, we know that this sinking was inevitable. The destruction actually was inevitable because we know from our modern perspective that that ship did sink. That symbol of capitalism did sink. So what is Priestley trying to tell us about the ship, about capitalism, about the status quo? He is trying to say that both the Titanic and the Edwardian social hierarchy will inevitably sink, will be inevitably destroyed. So we shouldn't listen to the foolish, selfish and hubristic Mr. Birling, because history has taught us different to the ideas of men like this, is what Priestley's trying to say.